Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. My name is Emily Wilkins. I'm the current Vice President of the National Press Club, and I am a congressional reporter with Bloomberg Government. Thank you so much for joining us both here and online, and for our headliner event with actress and social justice advocate Ashley Judd. We are so happy to accept your questions, and after Ms. Judd's opening remarks, I'll ask as many as time permits. To submit a question online, please email headliners@press.org and put Judd in the subject line. If you're on Twitter, we encourage you to tweet using the program, and please use the hashtag NPC Live. And for our C-SPAN and public radio audiences, an important note, please be aware that in the audience we do have members of the general public, so any applause or reaction that you hear is not necessarily from the working press. It is now my pleasure to introduce this distinguished head table. Please stand when your name is called, and we'll begin with my right. We'll skip over Ashley for just a second to Jed Judson, a journalist covering land warfare for Defense News and past National Press Club president. Larry Strickland, who is Ashley's pop, and we're so pleased that he could join us today. Next to him, we have Gabriella Border, U.S. National Affairs correspondent for Reuters. Next, we have Maya Lene Burra, general assignment producer for PBS NewsHour. And on the right side, last but certainly not least, Lisa Matthews, the planning director and deputy director for U.S. News with the Associated Press and past National Press Club president. And of course, on my left, we have Dinah Lanwan-Liget, president and founder of DC Media Strategies and another former past NPC president. We have Trent Spinner, editor-in-chief of the American Psychological Association. We have Ted Johnson, politics and media editor with Deadline. Laurel Stein, executive vice president and chief policy officer for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Allison Kojak, acting global investigations editor with the Associated Press and another past National Press Club president. And Dr. Christine Moutier, the Chief Medical Office for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Thank you all so much for joining us. And of course, our guest of honor, who I am very thrilled to hear from, Ashley Judd. Ashley Judd has been a household name since her feature film debut in the title role of the 1993 film Ruby in Paradise. Her acting career has since spanned 3 decades, including such favorites as Divine Secrets of the Ya-Ya Sisterhood, Berlin Station, Sisters, and Heat. In between, she managed to earn a mid-career Master in Public Administration degree at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, devote herself to a wide array of humanitarian causes focused on gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights for women, and serve as a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations Population Fund. In recent years, however, it's her advocacy on sexual harassment and assault that has earned headlines. In October of 2017, Ms. Judd became the first movie star to go on the record in the New York Times article that detailed Hollywood studio executive Harvey Weinstein's predatory behavior, effectively launching the Me Too movement. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm clapping on that one. When Time magazine named the Silence Breakers as its Persons of the Year in 2017, it included Ms. Judd among women on its cover. This year, Ms. Judd has turned her formidable passion to issues of suicide and mental health after her mother, Country Hall of Fame singer Naomi Judd, tragically took her own life. She was 76 and had struggled for years with mental health. Last week, Ms. Judd accepted the Survivor of Suicide Loss Lifesaver Award from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention for her advocacy work that has included urging journalists to rethink how they cover mental health and suicide. Ms. Judd, we are deeply sorry for your devastating loss. We are grateful to have you with us today so we can learn more about your experience and how it can help us become better reporters. Everyone, please welcome me in giving a warm National Press Club welcome to Ashley Judd.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emily, for that kind introduction. Sometimes when I hear that bio, I think, how does a kid like me end up in a place like this? Good afternoon, esteemed members of the press, the National Press Club, my family, my friends, my chosen brothers, Silas and Jason, the folks watching on C-SPAN, public radio. It is good to be in community with you. We can pretend to care, but we cannot pretend to show up. I am so grateful to address the National Press Club for the third time. I've previously had the honor of being in conversation with you about HIV/AIDS, male sexual violence, gender equality, the striving for gender equality, and poverty alleviation in my travels to 22 countries around the world, and also on the wholesale environmental devastation in Appalachia caused by mountaintop removal coal mining. And today, we're going to bring the circle of humanity closer in to my biological family, to, as was referenced, my beloved mother, and the media's coverage of her death by suicide. And specifically, I'm here to exhort you, the media, to hold yourselves, those of you who don't already, and some of you do, and I very much want to acknowledge that, to hold yourselves to the reporting standards established by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's evidence-based and data-informed standards, which are already included in most of your style manuals. The way that you report about death by suicide, and it is death by suicide, not committed, as some journalists still continue to write, let's start there, can act as a contagion and cause a rise in deaths, and we'll talk more about this later, and even inspire copycat deaths of the same method. The media has a grave responsibility, and I am here to mirror that to you. And for those of you who are not yet following those standards, to help hold ourselves mutually accountable. But first, I make no assumptions that all of you know exactly who my mother was, or that much about her. So I would like to let us get to know her a little bit. Naomi Ellen Judd, née Diana, was born on the 11th of January, 1946 in Ashland, Kentucky, a small coal town in Appalachia. Later, taking her identity into her own hands, as was her wont, she changed her name to Naomi, and her parents were young. Pauline Ruth was just a teenager when Diana was born, and her daddy, Glenn, had an Ashland oil fill-in station and the coldest Coca-Colas in town. The eldest of 4 children, Naomi wrote in her own hand on the back of a baby picture, was always smiling. Belonging and connection were urgently important to her, and it was she, even as a youngster, who remembered everyone's birthdays. She believed there was a crocodile in the basement. His name was Gillette because his teeth were razor sharp. Unexpectedly pregnant at 17 while her family was falling apart as her younger brother Brian was dying of a childhood cancer, she married a boy who was not the child's father, which was not totally uncommon at that time. And then she gave birth again at 22 to me. Full of yearning, Naomi was restless. The emergence of her older daughter's unmistakable musical brilliance at about the tender age of 8 midwifed in her a dream, a spectacular technicolor dream that broke with her family's humble heritage. Who knows where her powerful imagination came from? Perhaps the books at the library on Central Avenue in Ashland, Kentucky. She cultivated preternatural mother-daughter harmonies and eventual stardom. The result was that she became an icon and a legend who left country music better than she found it. Naomi was complex and dynamic. She was every woman, a nurse, a single mother who was sometimes living on public assistance. She was a survivor of early childhood sexual abuse at the hands of her Uncle Charlie, as well as intimate partner violence, a rape about which she spoke very boldly, and she lost a job when she wouldn't go away with a male boss for the weekend, leaving her in deep trouble when she tried to pay the rent for my sister and me. She was Mama to her grandchildren and to my chosen family. and she was totally extraordinary. She sold millions of records. She was a 5-time Grammy Award winner and a Hall of Famer, lauded by millions. And this part, a lot of people don't know. She was totally brilliant and loved the Nobel laureates and pioneers of science with whom she kept company. From the current Nobel laureates, Svante Pablo, to Marvin Minsky, whose name she loved to drop. From Dr. Collins, Francis, for whom she wrote the ditty, The Big Bang Boogie. And to Dr. Tim White, who led the discovery of the earliest hominid skeleton, Artie, and Maya Angelou were mutually adoring of each other. These folks were her friends and her conversation partners and came to stay at our farm, and she was besotted with neuroscience and kept fat volumes on her bedside table, which she read daily. And she was also my mama. She was soft and she smelled pretty. Her smile melted me, and she hugged me all the time and told me I was her darlin' and her sweet pea. She bought me Whoppers from Walgreens, and she made lavish Easter baskets even when I was all grown up. Every time she went out to eat, she asked me if I was hungry, especially if they had anything with hot fudge on the menu. She came to all my chosen family gatherings because she loved my people and they loved her. And when I asked her about being that named source in Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey's Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting on Harvey Weinstein, she said, "Oh, honey, go get him." And when I was campaigning for the candidate of my choice in the most recent, in the presidential election before last, she thought my candidate was wackadoodle, but I knew her candidate was wackadoodle. And she came up to support me anyway and watched me speak, and she was in full hair and makeup. She didn't slouch and hide in the back, and afterwards she said, "Oh, honey, you were perfect. They're so lucky to have you." And when I spoke at the Women's March in 2017, she told me she was enthralled by my audacity, even though her favorite news channel gave me a licking. She was a good mother to me. She was a good mother. And she had a disease that lied to her, that was an unfair foe, that lived rent-free in her head and caused her irreparable suffering, and eventually made her hurt so badly that she believed on that day that she would only get worse and never better. Her disease was a thief. It took her hope, and it took her life. When the first responders arrived in Mom and Pop's bedroom, where her body lay laboring, the energy and the atmosphere in that room shifted radically. And where I sat in precious transition with my mother as she was about to be breathed into the infinite presence of God, we were instead bombarded by the militarized and squawking, lumbering intrusion of non-trauma informed police and EMT, and I was yanked from her side. An EMT yelled at me. A sheriff insisted on starting to question me right then and there. Clumsy people clambered all over this delicate space, and this was not their fault. This is how they are trained, or perhaps we could say how they are not trained. And that day, while in the most profound distress of my life and rocked by active trauma, I was interrogated 3 more times, and not once was it suggested that I had any rights or any choice in the matter. I wasn't asked if I needed to collect my thoughts, if I needed to defer my thoughts to a later time, or asked if I wanted a comforting person present, or even offered a glass of water. I was just pushed by question after question about what drove my mother to do it. And while being forced what it felt like to answer these bewildering questions on the most shocking day of my life, discovering my mother with a bullet wound, I later discovered that everything was being filmed on body camera, 4 hours in total. I was also being audio recorded, and I was answering to the best of my ability because, like most of us, I'm conditioned to respect authority and to be compliant with law enforcement. And I was in clinical shock. And in the interview room at the police station, where I was told to go after I left my mother's body, sobbing, saying the 23rd Psalm with my Uncle Mark and my sister, I actually had to ask if I was being recorded because I was not told that I was being recorded. And I never would have known if I'd not been heads up enough to say to the person, is this being filmed? Because that's what they do on television, they film it. Also, crucially, I had no idea that everything I was saying in the state of Tennessee was public record. Which brings me to you today, the National Press Club and the media. Just because a police report is indeed public record does not mean that you can or should broadcast or print it. What the law does not constrain, common sense and basic decency should. Once the Sheriff's Department investigation of Mom's death by suicide was closed, those interviews I was given no choice in providing, plus a long interview that Pop gave when a deputy sheriff showed up at my house 4 days later, and he was so gullible and so vulnerable. And that was also recorded. All of it became accessible to anyone in Tennessee with a Tennessee address. We filed a lawsuit advocating on our own behalf that the publication of these interviews with all of these profoundly intimate details of Mom's mental health condition the morning of her taking her own life, the nature of her dysregulation in the kitchen that morning that she was experiencing. Our lawsuit said that this should not be fodder for public consumption or grist for the gossip mill. We were treated badly during the legal process. The county judge forced us, saying we would be in contempt of court if we did not cite the media as a plaintiff. That was never our intention. The media is not our adversary. You are our ally, and we're here to cooperate with you. Ultimately, we withdrew, understanding our cause was lost in that courtroom. And thus, some members of the media began to request the police report and obtain it, and all its contents, its attachments and images, and even my 911 call. And the consequence of this is that photographs of my mother's death by suicide in her bed now live forever in perpetuity on the internet. The note she wrote in her disease, and not from her mother's heart, stalk and haunt my sister because it was about her. The intimate medical details I divulged, the sort of personal information that should be protected by HIPAA, are available for anyone to gleefully attach to my mother's personality and reputation, overcoming and overwhelming the parts of her that were untouched by her mental illness. Our family lives with the permanent tragedy of the loss of our matriarch. And because certain media published the bloody images of her death in our interviews, we live with a form of public violence that complicates and compounds our lifelong grief. And sometimes when I walk through an airport and people look at me with curiosity, I don't know what they see or what they think. And of course, as if there weren't enough, and it's outside the scope of this talk, there were the rumors and the false stories, and all of that got very out of hand as well. Our protest to this violation of decency and privacy is not just for us. It is for every family that has experienced death by suicide. I have had the will and the stamina to take up this fight, and our family has had the means for that legal case, knowing that so many others could not afford either the emotional labor or the financial cost, much less access and a venue like the National Press Club. Equally, I mentioned earlier Mom's longing for connection and belonging. She loved people. She would stand next to someone at a storefront looking at a pair of shoes, and she would just blurt out, "What's your passion?" I never saw the previews at the movies because she would tarry in the lobby signing autographs. And whether we were at Sunday buffet after church or on a flight, she would have conversation. She never met a stranger. And our actions on our behalf of her love of people and the wider American community, because when one of us is hurt, all of us are hurt. Once a death has been ruled such by law enforcement, there is no public interest served in the publication of further details surrounding the person's mental state, the manner of self-harm, and certainly not photographs of the death scene. Since the circulation of images of Mom and our interviews, scores of suicide families, if not hundreds, have come up to me or posted on social media to me stories of the local newspapers publishing their details. One woman said that the story of her death, of her loved one's death, ghoulishly popped up and said, "Oh, this place is haunted, this dormitory is haunted because of a death by suicide." And news outlets carrying violent details of their loved ones' deaths. This is some of the media's responsibility, or in some media's case, irresponsibility. And you carry so much responsibility, for when you publish about suicide in this way, it does act as a contagion. It deposits suggestive ideas in the minds of folks who are vulnerable to suicide and can lead them to take action on their thoughts. And there is substantial and decades-long body of scholarship on the contagion, over 100 studies, in fact. Dr. Madeline Gould, professor of epidemiology and psychiatry at Columbia University, and recent recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award for Research given to her by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, has extensively documented the phenomenon of suicide contagion from media coverage. Her conclusion is, and I quote, "Media coverage of suicides has been shown to significantly increase the rate of suicide, and the magnitude of the increase is related to the amount, duration, and prominence of coverage. Specifically, when you discuss the method of death, and the method of death in details, such as with my mother, research has documented an increase in suicides afterwards, especially in reporting on the deaths of celebrities." Here is the conclusion from the British Medical Journal, one of the oldest journals in the world, from 2020, published by doctors from all over the world, Europe, North America, and Asia, not from Africa and Southeast Asia, I apologize. Reporting of deaths of celebrities by suicide appears to have a meaningful impact on total suicides in the population. The effect was larger for increases by the same method as used by the celebrity. The best available intervention at the population level to deal with the harmful effects of media reports is guidelines for responsible reporting. These guidelines should be more widely implemented and promoted, especially when reporting on deaths of celebrities by suicide. These are the standards. They're available on afsp.org, and they include things like, don't put it on the front page. I'm going to call out the New York Times for their reporting on the recent suicide at Lawrenceville. That was about class, that was about elitism, that was about white privilege. Right there, front page below the crease. They could have done it differently, and they could have done it better. Dr. Madeline Gould was talking about that at our event last week, and it had to do with money because there was a financial payout. Never say committed, say death by suicide. Never talk about the method. Never talk about it as skyrocketing. Always provide the suicide hotline number. Talk about how there is help. Talk about how there is hope. Talk about it as a mental health issue, how there is treatment that is available. You can look those things up, and they are the standards in my family, Naomi Judd's family, and all families affected by mental illness. We ask for your journalistic integrity. We will be reading, and we will be watching, and we thank you. So that is your part. So what about the law? As many of you have discerned, I'm a little bit of a fighter, and I have my opinions. And I have, since a man molested me when I was 7 and immediately went to 2 adults and said, this is what happened. And so in Tennessee, we are fighting to change the law that allows these police reports and death by suicide to become public record. And you notice that you have a cookie on your table. We call this law Naomi's Law, and it is simple, it is straightforward, it is obvious, and it states that death by suicide records, medical records, police reports, interviews, the 911 calls. My 911 call is available on the internet. That is an obscenity. Should not be public record. An individual may go to a court and petition if there is rightful reason, if it's not too onerous on the family, if it's not too invasive, so it does carve out an exception. And we need your help. This bill will be in front of a summer study this summer. Tennessee legislators will be taking it up, but we have a major pushback from the lobbyists. They are the greatest obstacle to this fair, decent, appropriate law being passed. We've created a pledge for folks to sign saying they will support journalism that adheres to these standards of integrity as evidence-based and data-informed, published by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and that they will not support journalism that is salacious and does all the things that my family experienced. So we thank you in supporting us in our pledge. My mom and everyone who walks with mental illness and dies by their own hand is far more than a diagnosis or a simple day. I've been relentlessly haunted by finding my mother as she lay dying, and I've invested so much emotional labor into healing my trauma. I am grateful I have a plethora of other memories about her, such as how she managed to hide Easter eggs in our tiny one-bedroom apartment. She and I actually shared a mattress on the floor in the living area, and she managed to hide Easter eggs where there was just nowhere to hide them. And I have newer stories too, such as when I was consulting with a legal scholar at Vanderbilt about if we could carve out exceptions for that body camera and not have it be published. We didn't have a lot of success with that, but he was a wonderful person who did a lot of work with me trying to explore how the body camera outside the house would not be on the internet. And when he and I were done with our consulting, he actually sent me an email and said, you know, your mom took my class. She was brilliant, and she asked the smartest questions. And I worked with another lawyer when we were trying to see what we could do about her autopsy becoming public record. And when he and I had concluded our work and the autopsy was public record, he sent me an email. And he said, you know, not once but twice, my wife was in 2 different stores, Costco, a place my mom loved to go, and the bookstore, her other favorite place. And he said, my daughter, whom he was quick to add was now a very calm adult woman, was having major meltdowns and just so much more than my wife could handle. And your mom came up to my wife and said, you know, I raised 2 very headstrong girls and I understand, and is there anything I can do to help and support you in this moment? That's the kind of woman my mom was. Everyone deserves to be remembered for how they lived and not what happened on the day they died. Thank you so much for your kind attention today. My family and I appreciate it. Peace be with you.
That was absolutely beautiful. Ashley, thank you for sharing that in just such a touching and beautiful way. And I think I speak for everyone in this room when we just say what a brave and admirable thing it is for you to continue to fight for your mother and to share her legacy and her story and who she was as a person. And I'm very excited too that you've brought this conversation to us about how journalists and the media do need to cover times where folks do die by suicide, and how we need to cover that in the media, how we need to cover mental health. And I wanted to sort of ask, because you referenced the phrase death by suicide versus commit suicide. Yes. Help us kind of parse the difference and why that matters.
So committed comes from when the Catholic Church stated that committing suicide was a cardinal sin, unforgivable, and that you went to hell and had eternal damnation. That's where committed comes from. It was committing a sin from which you were never to be redeemed. You couldn't be buried in a religious cemetery, and that is the origin of the language committed. And so obviously, saying death by suicide is more appropriate, and the language evolved through in the psychology and psychiatric spaces from completed, and then they, in the 70s and the 80s, and then they thought, oh, well, then you didn't complete, or you completed, do you complete an act, do you complete, and then they settled on, in professional mental health care spaces, died by suicide. And so that is the standard that professional mental health care professionals prefer, and I think that we should roll with the experts.
And speaking of rolling with the experts, and you mentioned this in your speech, that you have recommended the media guidance set out by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
Yes.
What stands out to you in particular about this resource compared to maybe others that are out there?
Well, this is what they do. This is what Dr. Moutier has spent her career doing over 25 years. And someone like Dr. Madeline Gould, who's been researching suicide and suicidality for 43 years, and Dr. Rory, who was another award recipient the other night, his body of work is so focused on what causes a person to go from the ideation and that gap from ideation to taking the action. And it's, his work is obviously vast because he's been doing it for so many decades, but he does look at that contagion and what the impetus is, because it's very suggestive when vulnerable people read about another person's death. Like when Anne Sexton died, she, the poet, it was prompted by someone else's death, and then someone else said, oh, that should have been my death, and then she went ahead and killed herself. So it does have this attractiveness when someone who has thought about suicide before and sees someone else take their life. It becomes more accessible, it becomes more doable, it becomes normalized. And so where and how we talk about it needs to be very cautious if we value human life.
And that kind of gets to what you were saying in terms of making sure that we are, talking about it as a mental illness, making sure that we are talking about as providing resources,
Yes.
kind of really taking those steps to make sure that any death is really put within that wider context, and that folks who read the coverage, do not feel like they too need to take that step.
It should be focused on the solutions and not on the problem, because it's abusive to point out a problem without highlighting a solution. And we have enough abuse in the world and in our news.
I hate to say that that's a good transition to the next question, but unfortunately it is. I wanted to ask you a bit about the media's coverage of people with mental health issues recently, and sort of just mental health more broadly. Recently, of course, we've seen criticism for some of the media coverage of New Yorker Jordan Neely's killing, which focused on his behavior and his mental health history. I wanted to see what your perspective on how the media covered that story.
Right.
What could we have done better?
Right. So unfortunately, I can't answer that with a lot of background because I'm aware of the story, but I haven't read about it extensively. So I'm not really qualified to answer that story. Dr. Moutier, have you followed it? Would you like to respond? Okay. I mean, I would say in general, I'll tell you a story. There was a family who came to a hermit during the time of the Desert Mother and Fathers. And they said, we would like to ask you to pray over our daughter because an evil wizard has turned her into a donkey. And this, just roll with me, it's just a short little story. And the hermit said, I would be delighted to. And he brought the daughter in and asked the parents to sit aside. And the hermit said, would you like something to eat? And she said, that would be very nice. And he began to talk with her about things that were of interest to her. And when the parents saw the great tenderness with which the hermit fed her and talked with her, their eyes were opened, and they saw that indeed the evil wizard had not turned their daughter into a donkey. The evil wizard had turned their perception of their daughter into a donkey. And the daughter herself was greatly relieved, because it's very hard to be a little girl when all your parents see is a donkey. We need to see the person through the disease.
I love that story. That's fantastic. You've also shared your painful experiences of discovering your mother's body in a guest essay in the New York Times. Why was it important for you to be able to craft how you shared your own story? And how can the media work with others to make sure that they are empowered in the same way?
I appreciate the question, and it's important to broaden out what that essay was about, which was very much about the right to privacy and decency in death. And we're an uncannily open family, and there's a difference between privacy and secrecy. You know, we don't really have a lot of secrets as a family, you know, which sometimes I resented growing up. It would have been nice to have a little bit of something set aside. And you know, I just recently got a message from someone who said that she had a loved one die by suicide so many decades ago and she still can't talk about it. And I know that it's important to be able to share experiences because that's a part of growth and healing. And, you know, in my trauma work, I've had to be able to unearth and get out of my psyche, get out of my body what has happened in order to take the charge out of it. And as my sister says, if it helps one person, then that's worth the price of admission.
And another thing that you point out in the essay, which was a great essay, by the way, if you haven't read it, I highly encourage you, is that your first words to the police who arrived on the scene were recorded on their body cameras, and then it was released to the public. For journalists, sometimes in certain situations, those words can be really important in helping us understand what is happening and making sure that we are doing accurate reporting, sometimes in particular in situations that are a little bit less straightforward. Of course, for you, that became a source of pain. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about sort of where you draw the line here? What kind of body camera footage and audio and 911 calls? Should there be some that are made public? Should there be a timeline that this happens on?
It's a really good question, and I appreciate it. And this is where we really want to partner with the press and be collaborative. No one told me that I was being recorded. And that's the part that I think is, can I use the word deceptive or unfair? I think that's the part that's unfair. It only would have been fair to say, wow, this is tragic and a mess. And as part of our discovery process, to help you and to help your family, we would like to roll body camera. Do we have your consent? I don't think that that's too much to ask. And that's on the police, that's not on the media, you know, because that's what happened with the police. And I don't know that it would have changed what I don't know that it would have changed what I said or do, but it's only, I just think that that's only fair. And then when it comes to the media, I think that that's also a part, I mean, the truth was the truth of the situation, and it's not going to change my response, but it's too secretive not to ask, and I don't really think that there's anything more to the answer than that.
Well, I wonder right now, since Naomi's law is not yet a law, you're still in the process of working on it, for the media out there and the reporters out there who do cover stories like this, what would be your recommendation as far as how we would approach asking for these materials, using these materials, kind of thinking about how to best incorporate them into our reporting so that we are telling an accurate story, but not causing people pain who frankly don't need to feel any pain?
When a person, I appreciate the question. When a person dies by suicide, what else do you need to know?
And I know, I'm thinking more of the body camera footage, the 911 calls. Sometimes it deals, I know there have been some, I think I saw in some 911 calls for active shooters. And I'm not sure if maybe that's the line, that it's the line of when it's a suicide versus when it's another crime where there is a potential danger to the public.
But see, crime is an operative word because death by suicide is not a crime. It's in our case, which is really my area of lived experience and thus my expertise, the police department has already closed the investigation and ruled that it's not a crime scene. And so there's no public interest served. It just becomes prurient.
Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of having these standards for suicides.
Yes.
Versus, and I hope I was clear, I was not trying to equate it as a crime. I was
Yes.
simply comparing it to cases where there are 911 calls. And they are related to crimes, but not suicide. Right. And so that kind of seems...
we are talking, we have guardrails around this conversation. We're talking about death by suicide. And when I went upstairs and discovered my mother and came downstairs and called 911, no one is served by listening to the shock and the dismay and the distress in my voice.
I also wanted to ask a bit about regulations that the federal government can put into place to ensure medical professionals are acknowledging the signs and the symptoms and that insurance companies are covering the care needed. Do you feel like sort of the wider ecosystem is there to support those who are struggling with mental health and who are potentially considering suicide?
So that's a really broad question and somewhat outside the scope of our conversation today. I think that we have a long way to go, just to address it briefly, in terms of how we support folks who walk with mental illness. You know, I know, for example, one of my bonus nieces went to treatment for having had some suicidal ideation, and none of it was covered by insurance. And he was absolutely getting appropriate care that was trauma-informed and addressing the distress that he had been in. And if his family had not had disposable income to spend, you know, he would not have received the care that he desperately needed. And so that's just to try to confine our discussion to more of the topic at hand. But yes, it's a very important thing, and no, we don't support. And I appreciate the Congressman's office that's represented here today that's working on expanding insurance coverage for those with mental illness.
And that's Congressman.
John, where are you? Are you still here? Okay, yes.
It's sorry, Congressman Moulton, Seth Moulton's office.
Yes, Seth Moulton's office from Massachusetts.
I know it's a busy day for everyone on the Hill.
Massachusetts.
We did have a question here, and I want to be careful about how I ask it. But the base of the question is, you know, you mentioned that your mother and yourself, I think, are public figures, beloved figures, figures that people tend to sometimes feel close to through the work that you put out in the world. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how we should treat a suicide when it is a celebrity suicide, when the person is a public figure. Should there be different standards when someone is well known?
I think that the research is very clear that that in particular has very high risk of contagion. Very high risk of contagion. So the report that I cited, and we can make my talk available, from the British Medical Journal, specifically notes that the inappropriate reporting of suicides amongst celebrities has an impact on copycat suicides.
Mm-hmm. So it's even more important then.
It's even more important.
It's even more important that we're really being very diligent, making sure to kind of use, you said, be careful with the language used, to not give more details that are necessary, and to kind of make sure that the article is noting that if others are suffering, there can be where they can find help.
Yes.
What steps can the media take to inform people of mental health and what the help is out there? I mean, what can we do to kind of, when we're just kind of going out through our day-to-day reporting, and maybe we're not covering necessarily a death by suicide, but what can we do in general to make sure that people understand that these resources are available, and to kind of, you know, just better understand the mental health crisis going on in this country?
Yeah. So I ragged on the New York Times earlier, so I will give them some credit for their wellness section, because I think that their wellness section does a very nice job of supporting mental health. You know, they have their article today from the Surgeon General about the loneliness epidemic and how to address loneliness. They focus a lot on community. They've had their recent article on, you know, if you're obstinate about yoga, there's really easy ways to start. And they talk about I think they do a very good job of supporting mental health in the articles that they print. And the AFSP website has its guidelines for promoting mental health in articles where you talk about death by suicide. Share the hopeful message that suicide is preventable in language, tone, and images used. When in doubt, contact pr@afsp.org. And does that help?
It does.
Okay.
It does. What was that website one more time? It's
Contact pr@afsp.org for more information or to talk to an expert.
I also wanted to ask a bit, just you've mentioned family, of course, a lot. you've mentioned your chosen family. How important are those family ties in dealing with before and after the suicide of a loved one?
So they're critical. And, you know, when it comes to teens and mental health, and they've been so in the news lately because of the recent CDC reports, but all the research shows that the single most important thing for a young person and their mental wellness is strong ties to an adult, a strong relationship with one adult. And it can be any adult. It doesn't have to be a major caregiver. You know, for me in the 11th grade, it was Maureen, my next door neighbor, who happened to be a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And, you know, when I went to the hospital after Pop was in Vienna, because Mom and Pop had been in Vienna and Pop was flying home, I had Logan, Laura, Heather. I had like 6 of my chosen girlfriends with me within 15 minutes. They all lived pretty nearby, and they were with me the entire time, and everyone divided up the duties. You know, Rachel and Tammy were in charge of food. Other people were in charge of taking out the trash. I didn't have to think about anything except be in my grief and help organize the Friends and Family Memorial. It's so important to have community, and you can find that community anywhere. Laura was my Zumba teacher at the YMCA. You know, and I met a lot of them in recovery circles. And Heather and I met at her best friend's husband's funeral. So you can pick up the people wherever you can find community in where you live and move and have your being in your world. Silas and Jason and I met in Kentucky because Silas and he's a fellow Kentuckian and writer, and we have lots of mutual interests, and they're my chosen brothers, and they're here today. It's crucial to have that kind of community.
I wanted to ask as well, because I think suicide is something that impacts a lot of us. Is there any advice that you have, and this might not be fully in today's topic, but I think it's an important question, signs that a loved one might be contemplating suicide, and what should we as their loved ones do at that juncture?
I would absolutely pitch that to Dr. Moutier, who's the Chief Medical Officer for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
You can bring the mic over. Oh. Or she can come this way. That is fine too. Thank you so much, Dr. Moutier. We appreciate it.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this event. It's incredible work in a moment where the public health crisis of suicide has been going on for a long time. And I think your loss and your passion as a family is a game changer, truly. So, you know, the thing is about warning signs about suicide risk. We all keep our feelings and our experiences very zipped up because we're socialized to present the happy face. And if you have an occupation or you're from a race and culture, those can present additional barriers where it is not okay to disclose that you're struggling in any way. We've misunderstood all of those things. These are matters of being human. Mental health is part of health. The brain is a physical organ in the body, and life around us affects all of this. Suicide is a complex health outcome. So when people are struggling, we have to become attuned to the signs that might look like the most subtle indications of behavior change. And it may sound like we're making a mountain out of a molehill, but what I would say to that is more people are having suicidal ideation these days, particularly young people, but actually across the lifespan. So number one, you cannot assume that that's not going on. And number two, the response to it is something that we all need, which is a caring and supportive listening ear. All you do in that moment is open up the dialogue and invite them to share what they are experiencing. And we all need more of that. So, the typical warning signs are very easy to read about. It's, changes in emotion, withdrawing. It's even irritability, losing your temper, drinking more, reckless behavior, giving prized possessions away. But I also look for change in tone of voice. When someone might be feeling, or not handing it to you on a silver platter, but expressing through their word choice or their tone that there may be hopelessness, feeling trapped, like they're a burden to others, overwhelmed, all of those could mean that there are suicidal thoughts going on. So, thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mutu. Thank you. And Ashley, we do have another question, and this one is from April Simpkins, who is the mother of a former Miss USA 2019 and Extra TV correspondent, Charlie Crust. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm sorry if I didn't. But the question is, how can she push for laws in her state regarding protecting the details of a suicide?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. I would urge you to find out what the law is in your state and adopt the language of Naomi's law if you don't have privacy protections already. And we would be happy to collaborate with you on that. Thank you so much for asking.
Can I ask, what are the challenges right now in getting Naomi's law passed?
Lobbyists.
Can you go into perhaps a little bit more detail? Are these a particular group of lobbyists? Why are lawmakers paying more attention to the lobbyists than to the
Government. No, it's just what it, I mean, I was talking with my colleagues from Global Situation Room, and that's really what it boils down to, yes. Because the lawmakers with whom we're working, they themselves support Naomi's law. I mean, as I was saying, it's very straightforward. It's really obvious. I think that the consensus is there. In death by suicide, it's not a crime, and these details do not need to be divulged to the public. It acts as a contagion. It's not helpful to anybody, and there are people who want to take the transparency to an extreme and see it as some kind of a slippery slope, and they just, I don't really have much more of an explanation for it, because to me it's not reasonable.
I mean, are there any, I'm curious, particular lobbying groups that are, because the things that you've laid out, they sound pretty common sense. And so I'm trying to better understand why this isn't already a law at this point.
Michael or Johanna, would you like to address that? Please. This is Michael Shipman. He's an attorney from Tennessee who's been the force behind drafting the language and working with our lawmakers in Tennessee.
Thank you so much.
If you would not repeat the question one more time.
I think the main question was why has there been a difficulty getting this into law?
Now, it's important that there is balance between open records and privacy, and the media lobbyists have pushed back generally against anything that shuts down open records at all. And that's been the struggle. It's just simply a hardline position that they take, that any law that closes down on open records, they will fight it. And I think it's from a history of there have been situations where they feel like, as Ashley said, that there's a slippery slope, and in this case, we feel like it's pretty straightforward.
Straightforward in the sense that the law is very clear and fairly narrow as far as...
Yeah, this is a very narrow section that we're dealing with. This is only dealing in a situation with a suicide. We are not expanding it beyond that. It's just a very narrow subset of facts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I know we also have a question specifically on the military, and what are, if any, of the suicide prevention and response issues that are unique to the military?
Right. I would look at the underlying causes of death by suicide in the military, yes. And I mean, there's so much trauma that inheres in that line of work, and so I would really focus on prevention. Yeah, and getting our active military and the veterans the support they need and deserve.
Mm-hmm. And again, it seems like this is one of those things where we want to strike a balance. We want to acknowledge that there is an issue out there. We don't want to put that under the rug, but at the same point, it's a matter of striking the right balance where we're not making the situation somehow worse in that public reporting.
So the reporting on the death by suicide shouldn't be so much about the suicide, but rather the policy that's driving, or the lack of policy and the lack of support that's causing these deaths.
I also wanted to ask you a little bit, because you are an actress, about the writer's strike that's currently going on. A recent Los Angeles Times headline read that Hollywood was built on the work of underappreciated writers. As an actress, do you agree with this, and do you agree with the point of view for those who are on strike this week?
So one of my best friends is a writer, and I know that she has not been able to move out of an apartment that her family and she have lived in since her children were born. You know, the kids share a bedroom, and she would love to be able to have her kids in a different school district, or, you know, be able to afford a flight to come see me in Tennessee from time to time, and these things are simply out of her reach as a Hollywood writer. And it's not to say she has a bad life, and there are people who, you know, economically are in much more difficult situations than she, but I know that the producers are making a lot of money, And I stand with the writers. I stand with the writers.
I also know that you've been active on the issue of guns, and I'm wondering if you think that strengthening gun laws would have helped situations like the one that your family went through.
Well, our topic today really is the privacy law, and I obviously have strong feelings about that, and I think that gun safety is really important, and in particular, making sure that, I just want to keep it for our topic for today, and I have a big platform and a lot of microphones, and so I'm going to have other opportunities to talk about that. But thank you very much for the question. I appreciate it.
I also, going back, I think, to the topic, as an investigative journalist, and this is one I think that came from our audience, we know that police officers and medical examiners will sometimes lie about the circumstances around people's deaths. It's part of the reason why we fight for open records, and I'm wondering how you respond to that.
I didn't really know that.
I know that you talked a bit about a balance
Yes.
between sort of what should be released and what shouldn't.
Right.
I mean, does this kind of, I'm wondering how much maybe is a law, how much is a guideline, how much is, as you mentioned, kind of common decency. If the regulations and the laws aren't there, the common decency should be.
Well, autopsies are public record in Tennessee, for example, so my mother's autopsy is public record. Does that answer the question?
I think to a certain extent, I think maybe you've kind of pointed to the guidelines, and maybe that's kind of what you're trying to get at, is that even if the law allows for certain things, that journalists should take the next step and kind of really consider what impacts their words are having, the language that they're using. Because I know that, it is unfortunately something that does happen where officials will not always be forthright and forthcoming.
Oh, that
with
of course I
reporters.
know about. Yes, I'm not that naive. I thought you frankly were insinuating something about my mother's death.
Oh, no, not at all. I think this is a very general question about just that balance between the transparency that we as journalists often seek to be accurate, but also kind of where you draw that line into what knowledge actually needs to be public and which information really does not need to be out there.
Right. Again, I'm just going to confine it to the topic that I was here for today. Thank you, though. You're giving me a lot of opportunities to share my thoughts and feelings. Wow.
Well, we appreciate the range that you've covered and your willingness to really delve into a difficult topic. I also see that I believe we only have a couple minutes left, and so before we get to the final question, I did want to take just a quick minute here to thank the organizers of today's event, headliners, co-team leaders, Don Juan Leger and Lori Russo, of course, as well as our executive director, Bill McCarran, club events coordinator, Cicely Scott Martin, and club membership director, Kate Helster. It was also my honor to be up here today. I know we went through kind of a lot of difficult questions, and it's a difficult subject area, and I appreciate your willingness to really engage on, I think, what is a very, very important area. And Ashley, it's now my honor to present you with the coveted National Press Club mug. I believe you now have 3 of them in a row. Thank you so much. And we do have one final question, and we decided to end this one. Oh, nope, just kidding. We're going to do this one instead. A Kentucky citizen asked, will you consider a run for elected office in the Bluegrass State?
Oh, my great Aunt Tottie'd be so happy. So I come from a long line of Democrats in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. My great Aunt Pauline named all her dogs after Democrats because she loved them so much. And I appreciate the question. And we could reorganize the roles, couldn't we, on the county level? That'd be a real good thing. I'll think about it. Thank you for your support and your belief in me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for your kind attention today. It really does mean a lot to my pop and my sister and me. Thank you.
All right. I'm told this is what we need to do. We are adjourned.